Since ancient times, there are things that were not meant to be accepted by anyone. Not everything that comes into our lives bears the mark of truth or God's will. Some words, no matter how harmless they may seem, are born to destroy and camouflage themselves under the appearance of advice, affection, or even concern. Certain messages penetrate the mind gently, but leave deep traces in the heart. These are words that, if accepted without a filter, shape identity, weaken faith, and silently move the spirit away from its purpose. In Proverbs 18 verse 21, it is written, "Death and life are in the power of the tongue, he who uses it well eats its fruit." Words have creative and destructive power, and they are not always loaded with good intentions. What makes this danger even more subtle is that we don't always recognize the origin of what we hear. Some phrases are installed disguised as truth, repeated by people close to us, by beloved voices, by figures who seem trustworthy. They are not presented as a direct attack, but as suggestions, warnings, or concerns. This is an old method. In Eden, Satan did not impose his will on Eve, he just asked a question, "Is that how God said?" Genesis 3 verse 1. With a single sentence, he planted doubt and distorted the understanding of the truth. It was not a direct lie, but a skillful distortion. This pattern repeats itself to this day. If this message is making sense to you so far, take the opportunity to like, comment, and subscribe. Your participation strengthens this reflection and helps others to also find this content. How many times have phrases like "you will never change" or "this is not for you" penetrated your thoughts and become fixed there as absolute truths? When these words are accepted, they become roots that bind, demotivate, and prevent the action of grace. It is at this point that many lose their way and start to live according to what they heard, and not what God says about them. In Matthew 12 verse 34, Jesus declares, "Out of the abundance of the heart the mouth speaks." This shows that what we say, and, consequently, what we accept to hear, originates from the essence. Negative words, if absorbed, reveal a heart that is hurt, led astray, or influenced by deception. The story of the spies sent to the Promised Land is a striking example. 10 men returned with reports of defeat and fear. His words undermined the faith of an entire generation, who ended up dying in the desert. But Joshua and Caleb, who refused those words, entered the Promised Land, Numbers 13:30. The difference wasn't the setting, it was the voice they decided to follow. The acceptance of words contrary to the promise is the first step in deviating from it. That's why 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5 guides, "We destroy arguments and every high thing that exalts itself against the knowledge of God, and we take captive every thought to make it obedient to Christ." Control is not in what others say, but in what you choose to believe. In times of so many opinions, advice, and influences, knowing how to filter is essential. Not every word is worthy of being received, and not every voice is allowed to shape our identity. One of the enemy's greatest strategies is not to attack us with force, but to weaken us with subtlety. The case of Peter trying to stop Jesus from going to the cross is revealing. He did not want evil, but was used to suggest a path contrary to God's plan. Jesus' response was firm, "Get behind me, Satan." Matthew 16 verse 23. Even though he was well-intentioned, Pedro was the channel of destructive advice. Not all advice that sounds good is in fact correct. Proverbs 14 verse 12 warns, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but its end is the way of death." Words and ideas that seem sensible can derail an entire destiny. The Bible guides us to test everything, to discern, not to accept any word as absolute truth. It is the Holy Spirit who guides to the truth, and the truth never contradicts the word. 1 John 4 verse 1 instructs, "Do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits whether they are of God." Words filled with fear, accusation, or doubt do not edify. On the contrary, they enslave the mind and distance the heart from God. Often, what seems like a simple unimportant comment is, in fact, a seed sown so that, at the right time, it can produce distortion and spiritual paralysis. Therefore, it is necessary to carefully monitor what is allowed to enter the heart. Spiritual life is not just built on prayers and good intentions, but also on conscious decisions about what you accept, what you reject, and who you listen to. It is in this vigilance that one decides whether the destination will be the desert or the promise. Spiritual prison does not always come from great tragedies. Often, it begins with a single misplaced word, an ill-advised piece of advice, or a phrase filled with doubt. The problem is that, over time, these little seeds grow and suffocate the truth in the heart. When Moses sent the spies into Canaan, the expectation was a faith-based report. However, what reached the people was a portrait of fear. The land was good, but the men who lived there looked like giants. The spies said, "We looked like grasshoppers before them," Numbers 13:33. This mental image destroyed the people's courage. The words spoken by those men were accepted as reality. They suppressed the promise that God had made. The people preferred to believe the spies' report rather than the voice that had taken them out of Egypt with a powerful hand. And because of this choice, they remained wandering in the desert for decades. Joshua and Caleb saw the same land, the same men, the same walls. But they decided to believe what God said. The difference was in which voice they allowed to echo within themselves. While some accepted words of defeat, others clung to the promise. Many lives today are paralyzed not because of a lack of faith, but because of an excess of opposing voices. Advice that seemed well-intentioned, phrases that were accepted without resistance, ideas that gained strength through repetition. All of this builds mental fortresses that are difficult to tear down without the truth of the word. There are those who still carry words heard in childhood, "You will never be anyone. This isn't for you. God doesn't love you like He loves others." These statements, if not confronted, become invisible prisons. The mind starts to move within limits that were not established by God. This is why Jesus, when tempted in the desert, responded with the scriptures. He didn't argue, he didn't rationalize, he didn't try to prove anything. He just said, "It is written," Matthew 4 verse 4. The truth needs no defense, only a declaration. The lie always disguises itself as an alternative. In Eden, the serpent offered knowledge as a gift, an advantage. He told Eve that her eyes would open and she would be like God. The proposal seemed generous, but its effect was devastating, Genesis 3 verse 5. Deception doesn't always come with the appearance of error. It often feels like wisdom, care, or protection. Peter tried to stop Jesus from dying. Balak offered Balaam riches to curse Israel. Both had apparently fair reasons. But they were outside of God's plan. The Apostle Paul was clear in teaching that the wisdom that comes from God is pure, peaceful, and full of good fruits, James 3 verse 17. When advice provokes fear, pride, or anxiety, it does not come from heaven, even if it seems logical. In the Old Testament, King Rehoboam preferred to listen to the young rather than the elders who had served Solomon. The advice he received was harsh, oppressive, prideful. As a result, the kingdom was divided and peace was destroyed, 1 Kings 12 verses 10 to 11. This episode shows how a single piece of advice can change the history of a nation. The decision to listen, accept, and apply a word needs to be treated seriously. Rehoboam's mistake was not deciding alone, but listening to the wrong voice. In return, Jethro advised Moses wisely. He suggested that he delegate responsibilities so as not to overload himself. The instruction was received, applied, and generated order and rest for all the people, Exodus 18 verses 21 to 24. The difference was in the origin and intention of the advice. Receiving words requires spiritual discernment. Not all praise is true, not all criticism is malicious. Not all advice has good intentions, and not all warnings should be rejected. Discerning is knowing what builds and what destroys. Spiritual life is not sustained by faith alone, but by constant vigilance. Knowing how to close your ears at the right time can be as important as knowing how to listen. The heart is the center of everything, and whoever controls what goes into it decides the course of their own life. Proverbs 4 verse 23. Throughout the scriptures, many have stumbled by accepting what seemed like a blessing but was a trap. The enemy is in no hurry. It disguises itself as an opportunity, a quick solution, an easier way. 2 Corinthians 11 verse 14 states, Satan himself disguises himself as an angel of light. After 40 days of fasting, Jesus was physically weak. It was at that moment that Satan appeared offering a practical solution, turning stones into bread. An apparently logical proposal, but one that went against God's will. Jesus refused. I knew that not every need justifies any solution. Many decisions that seem good at first turn out to be sources of pain later. Sarah, seeing the delay in the promise, suggested that Abraham have a son with Hagar. The plan seemed to work. Ismail was born. But the consequences of this choice continue to this day. Genesis 16 verse 2. True faith does not accept shortcuts. Wait. Trust. Supports. Haste is the enemy of purpose. And every decision that replaces the promise with a human alternative inevitably produces frustration. In Joshua 7, Achan saw, desired, and took what God had forbidden. A Babylonian mantle, silver, gold. It seemed like an opportunity one couldn't refuse. However, his act brought judgment on all the people. What seemed small caused great destruction. The appearance of blessing is no guarantee of divine origin. Judas accepted 30 pieces of silver in exchange for betraying Jesus. The value seemed advantageous. But the end was death. The weight of guilt was greater than he could bear. Matthew 27 verse 5. Avarice, pride, the desire for recognition, these are doors through which deception enters. Peter confronted Simon the magician, who wanted to buy the gift of the Holy Spirit with money. His intention was disguised as admiration, but it was tainted by greed. Acts 8 verses 18 to 20. Not everything that glitters is gold. Not everything that excites is true. The enemy specializes in offering what seems right to take the focus away from what is eternal. What seems like an advantage today, tomorrow could become a bond. Daniel, upon receiving news of the death sentence decreed by the king, did not rush. He gathered his friends and sought God's direction. He didn't act on impulse. He did not accept the first alternative. This choice saved lives. Daniel 2 verses 17 to 18. The filter for discerning whether something is from God is not emotion, nor urgency. It is peace, the confirmation of the Word, the testimony of the Spirit. Philippians 4 verse 7 affirms that the peace of God guards the hearts and minds of those who are in Christ. There are paths that present themselves as a blessing, but they are carefully designed traps. The story of Balaam is a clear example of this. He knew God's will, but insisted on seeking a new answer, motivated by Balak's offers, and ended up embarrassed. When one insists on forcing a divine response to justify a personal desire, confusion is certain. God may allow it, but the price will be high. Not all permission is approval. Not every opening is direction. David understood this deeply. In Psalm 55 verse 22, he wrote, "Cast your care on the Lord, and he will sustain you. He will never let the righteous be shaken." Trusting God is choosing to wait, even when the solution seems too long. The most dangerous traps are those that look like answers to prayer. If they are not assessed with discernment, they can turn into disasters. When faith is replaced by haste, destiny is lost. The true sign of spiritual maturity is not knowing how to do it, but knowing how to refuse. Rejecting what seems good, but does not come from God, is one of the greatest tests of trust. The blessing that comes from heaven never brings confusion, fear, or guilt. It is complete, lasting, and coherent with the will of the Father. There is one especially sensitive area where many lose their way: relationships. Few things shape your spiritual trajectory as much as the people you choose to walk with. Not every connection is divine, and not every bond was established for edification. Some relationships seem like blessings, but they are prisons in disguise. Samson, anointed by God, fell not for lack of strength, but for maintaining an alliance with someone who did not respect his calling. Delilah persistently undermined his strength until he gave away his secret and lost everything. Judges 16 verses 16 to 17. The enemy does not always act through direct confrontation. Sometimes all he needs is to put someone alongside the right person. Someone with subtle influence, who questions slowly, who offers well-intentioned advice but not in line with the truth. In 1 Corinthians 15 verse 33, it is written, "Do not be deceived, bad conversations corrupt good morals." The text does not just talk about sin, but about influence. Conversations that distort, ideas that contaminate, companies that weaken. The story of King Ahab and Jezebel is a clear portrayal of this. Ahab was not innocent, but his union with Jezebel hastened his downfall. Together, They promoted idolatry, persecuted prophets, and destroyed altars. Jezebel's influence was not limited to the king, contaminated an entire nation, 1 Kings 21 verse 25. In contrast, there are connections that open doors of redemption. Ruth decided to remain by Naomi's side, even without guarantees. Her loyalty to a woman of faith took her to the center of God's plan. Became part of the lineage of the Messiah, Route 1:16-17. The difference between a destructive relationship and one that builds is in the fruit. What brings God closer, strengthens faith and activates purpose is worthy of keeping. What steals conviction, weakens hope and creates confusion needs to be cut. Ananias and Sapphira formed a united couple, but in a lie. They agreed to deceive and together they faced the same judgment. Complicity in error may seem like a partnership, but it is an alliance against the truth, Acts 5 verses 1-10. This is why the Bible clearly advises, do not be unequally yoked with unbelievers, 2 Corinthians 6 verse 14. It's not about rejecting people, but about recognizing that there are bonds that sicken the soul and take us away from our purpose. Lot chose to live near Sodom, and his proximity became coexistence. When it was time to leave, he hesitated. He had to be forcibly removed by the angels. The bond with that place was deeper than I imagined, Genesis 19 verse 16. Relationships that seem harmless at first can become silent traps. Constant coexistence shapes thoughts, relativizes truths, and can put out the spiritual fire. Few turn away from God abruptly, most cool slowly. Proverbs 13 verse 20 teaches, he who walks with the wise will be wise, but the companion of fools will suffer harm. Walking with people aligned with the heart of God strengthens, brings clarity and protection against the subtle deceptions of the world. Even Jesus was selective with whom he walked most closely. Although he taught multitudes, he chose 12 to be at his side. And even among the 12, he maintained a more intimate circle with Peter, John, and James. He discerned intentions, he was not deceived by appearance, John 2 verses 24-25. Spiritual growth depends not only on the individual search, but also on those around the search. A word of encouragement at the right time can rekindle faith. Likewise, a negative phrase can erase an entire call. Choosing who to walk with is not a detail of the journey, it is a decision of destiny. Companies can be the bridge to purpose or the detour to perdition. Therefore, each bond must be filtered with prayer, discernment, and courage to say no when necessary. Many carry burdens that were not given by God. They are invisible weights that crush the soul, the result of words received, other people's expectations and pressures that have been internalized throughout life. Human beings have a tendency to hold on to what they should have already given up. Since Eden, man has tried to deal with guilt on his own. When Adam sinned, his first reaction was to hide. I heard your voice in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked, and I hid, Genesis 3 verse 10. Shame was the first burden he decided to bear alone. The problem is that none of these burdens bring peace. They drain energy, affect faith, distort identity. The people of Israel were freed from Egypt, but remained with the mentality of slavery. They murmured, they feared, they looked back. External freedom did not reach the heart, Exodus 16 verse 3. Moses, even called by God, reached his limit. He said, I cannot carry all these people alone, for they are too heavy for me, Numbers 11:14. He took on a weight that wasn't just his. He needed to hear from God that leadership should be shared. Jesus offered an exchange. Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light, Matthew 11 verses 28-30. He did not promise absence of burden, but guaranteed lightness for those who choose the right burden. Many live under the weight of guilt, as if God had not yet forgiven them. Others bow down to other people's demands, trying to please, respond, prove something. And there are those who drown in expectations that never came from God. Anna, before receiving the answer to her prayer, carried deep sadness. She cried, didn't eat, was teased. But the moment he prayed sincerely and surrendered his pain before God, his expression changed, even before the blessing arrived. 1 Samuel 1 verses 10-18. The psalmist wrote, Cast your care on the Lord, and he will sustain you, Psalm 55:22. The difference between sinking or standing firm is the decision to let go of what weighs too much. Anyone who tries to carry everything alone ends up collapsing. There are burdens that have been imposed by others. Words like "you have to be strong," "you cannot fail," "you have no right to make mistakes" create an emotional and spiritual prison. God does not demand perfection, He asks for delivery. What He expects is sincerity and dependence. Peter, after denying Jesus, wept bitterly. The pain was unbearable. But his story didn't end there. Instead of hiding forever, he waited for restoration. Jesus found him and reaffirmed his calling. The weight has been lifted, and the mission renewed. John 21 verses 15 to 17. The Apostle Paul urged the Galatians not to return to the yoke of spiritual slavery. He said, "Stand firm therefore in the freedom with which Christ has set us free." Galatians 5 verse 1. Many were freed, but continue to live as captives. The burden of the past, of comparisons, of fear, of doubt, all of this needs to be exchanged for the rest in God. He did not call anyone to live burdened. The cross was not only for salvation, but also for relief. Emotional burdens, old guilt, deep-rooted fears, none of these weights resist the presence of the one who said, "My peace I give to you, I do not give it to you as the world gives it." John 14 verse 27. The peace of Christ is the key to releasing what should have already been left behind. Living in peace does not mean the absence of struggles, but certainty that the hands that guide the journey are firm. When the right burden is given to the Lord, the path becomes clearer, the heart lighter, and the soul more available to hear the Father's voice. If this content spoke to you, leave your mark here. Comment, share, and subscribe to continue following reflections that strengthen your faith and awaken your identity in God.